Hey everybody, welcome back to another lecture. So today we're going to really start to try to dig in and begin our series of a couple lectures where we try to understand and explain why people engage in terrorist acts. And so today we're going to try to look at what we call individual and group explanation of terrorism before moving on to looking at and digging into more some particular political religious ideologies and how those can lead individuals to engage in terrorist acts. So, to start out, I want to give you your first discussion question right off the bat, even before we start looking at these particular explanations. And that is discussion question one: why do you think someone might turn to terrorism? Again, discussion question one: why do you think someone might turn to terrorism? Okay, so let's dig in. So, first, we're going to look at individual explanations of terrorism. And this largely gets broken down into two categories. And so, trying to explain why people ultimately turn to terrorism, one explanation is it has to do with particular psychological factors related to that individual. We'll dig into this a little bit more in a minute. And then also looking at the possibility that individuals engage in terrorism based on rational calculations, and this influences and determines why they ultimately are willing to carry out terrorist attacks. So let's start with the psychological conditions. And the first question we want to ask is, in this framework, is, are terrorists mentally ill? And this is a difficult question to ask. It begins our process of trying to think, are terrorists mentalities, are they truly in control of what they are capable of doing, or are they extremely mentally ill and perhaps, in the crudest form, saying, are they crazy? Try to stick a little bit more to formal language, but this would be the context of which we could start to think about this question. And so we could start to say, do terrorists experience certain mental conditions that increase and make them likely to carry out terrorist attacks, or ultimately, perhaps even we could say cause them to carry out terrorist attacks? And some of those conditions that people have studied and have argued are linked to the likelihood that someone carries out a terrorist attack are things like antisocial personality disorder, paranoid schizophrenia, narcissistic personality disorder. And these are certain things that can be argued can lead someone to ultimately be willing to engage in terrorist acts. And we run into issues, though, pretty quickly when we start to think about these perspectives, because we have to look at the fact that there are many, 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 many people around the world who have these various psychological conditions, but they don't actually ever end up carrying out terrorist attacks. So we have to try to understand why why, if psychological conditions do play a factor, why is it that some individuals who have these conditions ultimately engage in terrorist attacks and others don't? And we're going to look at these factors, as well as the rational factors, in our case study a little bit more when we look at the Norwegian terrorist Anders Behring Breivik, who carried out attacks in 2011. So we'll dig into that a little bit more in the case studies. But we also, in this psychological perspective, want to try to understand some of the factors that can lead individuals who might have certain conditions, especially things perhaps like narcissistic personality disorder, how they ultimately engage in violence. And there have been some explanations that have tried to move beyond just saying, okay, if someone has narcissistic personality disorder, they have an increased likelihood of terrorism. Well, previous scholars have created what they call this staircase of terrorism to try to understand how they perhaps move from having these conditions to ultimately being willing to carry out acts of violence. And so the way it works is we start with this idea of, on the ground floor at the base of this chart here on the right, we have this perception of unfairness. So in narcissistic personality disorder, certain other psychological conditions, there's oftentimes a perception of unfairness about the world, that individuals aren't actually getting what's due to them. They might undergo in what they call narcissistic personality disorder. They might undergo injuries to their ego. They have this perception that the world isn't giving them their due. And so what comes after that? Well, the next thing when you move up the next level in the staircase of terrorism is you're on floor one. And this is considering of options. So this leads us to the issue of what do you do once you think that the world isn't giving you your due? What is your response? And so a lot of times this can, especially for terrorists, the argument is it leads to this next level, level two, that there's a search for a target. This is looking for someone to blame for your perceived unfairness, for your perception that the world isn't giving you your just desserts. And what we have then is that if certain individuals, perhaps who go on to commit terrorist attacks, they move from just searching for a target to then starting to engage with the morality of terrorist organizations. They look for groups that perhaps, and others who think about things in the same way, who have these same perceptions, and they start to consider these extreme organizations and engage with the morality of their discussion. And do we, for example, we have with a far right terrorist group start to think that minorities are the responsibility for all of the injustices that they perceive that they have experienced. And so they start to engage, this potential terrorist starts to engage with this white supremacist ideology, rationalize it. And then step four, they really, in a lot of ways, move to joining this group or fully subscribing to this particular ideology. They move into this idea of an us versus them mindset. They really, at this point, have bought all into this particular worldview that, in a lot of ways, is giving them an outlet to express their frustration of their perceived unfairness, is giving them, and then ultimately gives them an option with step five, acts of violence, to take action to try to correct what they see as this perceived injustice. And so this staircase of terrorism, to some extent, is a way to try to understand perhaps how certain individuals might go from having a baseline psychological condition to ultimately being willing to committing an act of terrorist violence. So this sort of fits in this individual psychological framework. Another view of explaining terrorist, the willingness for individuals to engage in terrorist attacks, is this rational perspective. And this is the idea that terrorism is not determined, entirely by personality features or driven by the environment. So this is saying that terrorists don't have to have narcissistic personality disorder. They don't have to be paranoid schizophrenics. They can be relatively what we, quote unquote, normal people. That people can be willing and make choices to engage in terrorist attacks based on a rational mode of thinking to some extent. And this is the idea, just when we talk about rationality, it's basically the idea that individuals are making choices based on what they perceive as costs and benefits. So for most of us, right, we would perceive the cost-benefit analysis of these individuals as completely beyond the pale. But in this framework, if we're saying they're making their choices based on costs and benefits that they perceive, in their framework of thinking, the question is this a rational decision? And we have to think about this because we want to understand, why would an individual turn to terrorism, right? We all think that, most people think it's beyond consideration to do anything like what these people do, but these individuals start to think about it differently. They think about the benefits. They think about the status that they're going to gain from carrying out their particular text. They're going to think about the notoriety that they might receive. They're going to think about themselves as heroes. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in one of our case studies on domestic terrorism when we look at Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing. But this individual thinks that he thought that he was a hero. He was bringing about and playing a major role in initiating his white supremacist far-right ideology and initiating the movement that would bring about the change he thought would happen. And he would be a hero of this movement. He gains notoriety because people know who he is. the status is there. They are no longer just an obscure, where they might feel that the world perceives them as a nobody. Well, now from engaging in this act, they're making a rational decision to receive the benefits of that status. And they oftentimes then perceive the costs of human life that go along with that as not nearly as harmful as most people would. They see the benefits of what they're going to get from it as outweighing the cost of the human lives that they have to take to achieve their goals. And then, but the issue we have with this perspective is in some ways it sort of normalizes terrorism to some extent, right? This starts to come to the idea that it seemed like it would be pretty readily available for individuals, and more individuals could make this decision to rationalize and justify the benefits that they perceive to get from terrorism over the cost. So there's some issues here we get with this idea of just saying the willingness to engage in a terrorist act is a purely rational decision, especially when we think that most people, in their view of rationality, think that the choices these individuals are making is not comprehensible. So these are some of the elements we think about with these individual type explanations and how an individual might go through the process of ultimately getting to the place where they can carry out and commit a terrorist attack. So next we want to look at group explanations. And for group explanations, we're going to look at three things. We're going to look at the idea of depersonalization. We're going to think of this as thinking about how an individual, well, I'll describe it a little bit more here in a minute when we look at that slide. We're going to look at depersonalization, social cohesion, and bipolar worldviews, and how groups can facilitate these various things that influence an individual and make them willing to ultimately engage in a terrorist act. So the first idea is this sense of depersonalization, that groups can bring about the process of depersonalization. This is the idea that the group subsumes the individual. And this is the idea that individuals can feel the desire so strongly to become part of a group that they put the desires and interests of the group ahead of any of their own particular interests. And they oftentimes see these individuals in the group see themselves as interchangeable. They want to carry out and achieve the objectives of the group regardless of the costs to themselves. So we could see this in the willingness of an individual perhaps to carry out a terrorist attack. So a Palestinian terrorist who belongs to the Palestinian Liberation Organization may prioritize the desire of their group over themselves, and this may perhaps influence their willingness and ability to overcome the possibility of wanting to save their own life. Instead, they're willing to give it up in a suicide attack. And so this depersonalization of adopting this group mentality can ultimately lead an individual to engage in extremist acts that they might not have been willing to engage in if they didn't have group support or a group to be part of. And this sort of leads us right into this idea of social cohesion. And this is this idea that this collective identity promotes positive relationships. And this gets into the thought that people want to be part of groups, right? And even we think about, in some extent, the idea of our staircase of terrorism. A lot of these individuals might feel a sense of loneliness, and when they become part of a group, this can promote a collective identity that they want to be part of. There's this desire to further cooperation, to become part of a group, to feel that sense of belonging. And so the willingness to engage in a terrorist act and for a group to engage in terrorism may facilitate social cohesion. Working together to achieve these objectives, these extreme objectives, can allow these individuals to feel part of something. And that, in a way, facilitates this and continues the bonding of the group. And terrorist acts can play a major role in allowing these groups to continue to stick together. And so this can lead individuals to be willing to do these extreme acts for the group. And then finally, we get to this idea that how groups can influence people to be willing to engage in terrorism is that they facilitate this bipolar worldview. um, you really have a hardening of animosity towards what we call out groups. There's this us versus them mentality. We, the in group, are the righteous, the moral, and we had to do something about the out groups who are corrupting society, poisoning politics, destroying, the particular religion that they might belong to. And so this leads to a real negative perception of outsiders, people who aren't part of the group. And this is seen as also another factor of how groups can facilitate and influence a person's willingness to ultimately carry out a terrorist attack. They have to protect the in group at the expense of the out group, and terrorist attacks provide a way for them to actually go about doing that, to try to harm the out group and benefit the in group. And so this is seen as another factor that can really influence and impact the way that an individual might think about terrorism and in affect their willingness to actually engage in such an act. So for your second discussion question 2, I'm going to ask you, what might help inoculate someone from group pressures that could lead to terrorism? Again, discussion question 2, what might help inoculate someone from group pressures that could lead to terrorism? So then finally, just want to conclude here by looking at actually the group effects on rates of terrorism. So there's been some interesting studies to see how different elements of terrorist organizations can influence their willingness to engage in attacks. And what they found actually is that as the size of a terrorist group increases, the number of terrorist attacks that group perpetuates increases as well. And this seems to make sense to some extent, right? You have increase in resources, increase in the number of people who are part of your organization. The likelihood that the number of terrorist attacks a terrorist group perpetuates increases as their group size increases seems to fit with fairly fit with common sense to some extent, but has been shown through statistical analysis to be the case that as group size increases, number of attacks increase. But there's also been shown to be this element of a positive feedback loop for terrorist organizations and terrorist groups. So it's shown that as a group commits attacks, more people are willing to join, and then they carry out more attacks. So this, getting back to this idea that as group size increases, the number of attacks increases, but what really seems to drive in a lot of ways group membership is increasing the number of attacks, beginning to increase the number of attacks, facilitates increase in recruitment, which then facilitates even more attacks, and it has this positive feedback loop for terrorist organizations. And this seems to make sense in a lot of ways as well, because these groups continue to get their message out. The more attacks they are willing to carry out, the more people that they can communicate their particular agenda to. They can perhaps reach out to individuals who may be susceptible to this us versus them mentality, who may have a desire to feel this sense of social cohesion that we talked about with these group effects, may want to be part of a group that perhaps shares some of their sense of perceptions of unfairness about the world. The more attacks they create, the more it gets their ideas message out there, and the more people they could potentially end up joining and then carrying out more attacks. So what's interesting though is it's been found that the size of the group is not actually directly related to the intensity. So when we say intensity, we're looking at a predominantly number of people killed, injured in an attack. And so it is interesting that group size is not necessarily related to intensity. In some ways, this might be the case as well, because small groups may have an even stronger desire to plan meticulously to carry out attacks that are extremely intense, kill the largest number of people, injure the largest number of people, because they're trying to establish establish their notoriety, establish themselves on the map, get attention from the media, whereas large groups perhaps don't have to be as concerned about the intensity of every attack, because if they have more people, more resources, they can continue to carry out a large number of attacks. So any one attack doesn't necessarily have to be the largest scale event possible, because they already also have their name recognition. their attention in the media. So no matter what they do, they're going to get attention versus smaller groups that may need to have a major event get them the notoriety they need to burst onto the scene. So we'll leave it there. As I said, your case study that you have for today looks at some of these individual factors that led to the Norwegian terrorist Anders Behring Breivik carrying out his attacks in 2011. But we'll leave it there, and I hope you enjoy the case study, and I will talk to you again soon.